Hello and welcome to Forbidden Talk, where we discuss controversial issues in the Middle East and beyond. This week we shall be tackling prostitution and the escort industry. Prostitution, one of history's oldest occupations, although a very controversial issue, is still prevalent throughout the Middle East. It is also becoming increasingly common for Middle Eastern girls to work in this industry in Europe. Syria's war has driven many desperate women and girls into prostitution. The escort industry, on the other hand, can appear lucrative and glamorous, but there is a much darker side to it as well. We'll be discussing all these issues and more, but first I'd like to welcome our studio guests, Iman Abou-Atta, founder of Scheme, an NGO which works to promote social change for women and children within the Middle East and North Africa, and Cat Stevens, a sex worker and activist for the International Union of Sex Workers. Thank you for joining us in the studio.
Thank you.
And joining us later over Skype is Sara, Dr. Belinda Brooks-Gordon, Lisa Davis in New York, and over the phone from Lebanon, Carol Malouf. Before we get into our discussion, let's take a look at this brief report.
Prostitution, one of history's oldest occupations, a life chosen by some and imposed on others. An increasing number of desperate female Syrian refugees in countries like Jordan and Lebanon are finding themselves having to turn to prostitution. Though it is illegal in many countries throughout the Middle East, the industry is nonetheless quite outspread, and finding a prostitute isn't difficult. In Lebanon, prostitution is present under the form of a super nightclub, a massage center, or a licensed brothel. However, licenses have not been issued since the 1970s. In Egypt, prostitution was legalized in 1882 by the British occupying administration, and it wasn't until 1949 that the law was revised. Escorting, or call girls, another part of the adult industry, is sometimes referred to as the glamorous sister of prostitution. High-class escorts have been known to earn up to $40,000 for spending a weekend alone with a client. In 2012, Lebanese businessman Eli Nahas was sentenced to 8 years in prison and fined €50,000 for leading the Middle East's largest A-class prostitution ring, recruiting and supplying escorts to sons of presidents, Arab princes, and Muammar Gaddafi's son Mutassim. Though prostitution is an explicit trade of money and sex, the escort industry has existed on a basis of only paying for non-sexual companionship and time. But is this always the case?
Kat, firstly you. Tell us about how you got into the industry.
I think in circumstances quite similar to many of the people I know who are working, which is that I was in need of money and my options were relatively limited. And in a very roundabout way, through a friend of a friend of a friend of a I met somebody who is already working in the industry and actually started working with her and her husband. So I was doing threesomes with a woman and also threesomes with a man, seeing mostly male clients. They retired after a couple of years I'd been working with them, and since then I've been working on my own. I've worked in brothels, I've worked for escort agencies, I've worked mostly independently. My personal experience is that I've only worked in London, but obviously in London you meet people both in terms of clientele and in terms of people offering services from across the world.
And what sort of fees do you charge?
I'd say in terms of fees, a lot of it depends on location. So generally, outcall, when you're going to visit a client in premises, often in their hotel or at their home, you're looking at a higher rate generally than when people are coming to you, because obviously you've got the travelling time involved. And if you're working in central London, depending on the quality of the premises, the prices are often higher than if you're working in, for example, the suburbs. So it's similar to lots of other industries. For example, in terms of the restaurant industry, sort of central London restaurants tend to charge more than kind of, someone that's serving fish and chips in kind of zone 4.
Just to interrupt there, Iman, you work with Middle Eastern girls in the UK as well as in the Middle East, and they come to you. What are they saying to you?
So most of the Middle Eastern women that we work with are women actually who were forced into prostitution rather than being within their own will. And unfortunately, it is the case more in the Middle East than it's prevalent here in the UK, and that's because of the law and the legalization of different laws here of trafficking and forcing people into prostitution in the UK. So in the Middle East, this is quite becoming more prevalent, especially after the different conflicts that we've been having following the Arab Spring and the different revolutions. Obviously, it all started, or our highlights started in our work following the Iraq War and the impact on Iraqi women following the Iraq War, following the 2003 Iraq War.
But you know many Middle Eastern women who work in the industry as well. Are their stories very different?
I think it's not so much the country of origin that someone comes from. It's about the rights that they have, the legal rights they have, and their access to those rights. So if somebody is not in a position to defend themselves because they do not have the resources to do so, then they're much more likely to be exploited than somebody who is relatively well informed, or for example, somebody in the UK who speaks English fairly fluently is much more able to take care of themselves than somebody who is dependent on somebody else for translation, for access to services. So all those things I think are more influential than nationality. Though obviously in terms of coming to the UK, people's nationality, depending on your country of origin, you may have greater or lesser rights here. The final thing I think I'd say is that also we do see men coming from a range of countries who may be travelling from countries in which there are quite repressive social and legal attitudes to gay or bisexual men, and who may be coming to the UK and again may work in prostitution long-term or temporarily as a way of getting a foothold in this country.
Okay, Iman, what are the differences between an escort and a prostitute? Are there any differences?
Wow, I think that's rather a fine line between both of them, but nevertheless it depends on the person themselves. So sometimes escorts, they just accompany the person for the sake of fun or for the sake of spending some time together, but sometimes there is certain sexual intercourse involved in this. So I think it's down to the escort themselves to actually decide on this. And obviously when you're talking about prostitution, then obviously there is sexual involvement into this. And also even, I think under even the term of prostitution, there's as well certain limitations to what even prostitutes can actually give into a sexual intercourse.
Okay, great.
And I think that's one of the problems about criminalisation is because situations are criminalised. So for example, in the UK, it is legal to have sex for money. However, if an intermediary arranges for me to meet a client, that person is breaking the law. Even though they are, it's up to me whether I, sort of the actual person seeing the client is someone different. And so in that situation, it's difficult for people to say openly and honestly the services they do, exactly what's entailed.
Okay, great. Well, joining us now on Skype is Sara, a Muslim American escort who writes the blog An Exotic Escort's Diary, and who has agreed to speak to us on the condition of anonymity. Hello, Sara.
Hi, how are you?
Why have you chosen to keep your identity anonymous?
There's various reasons, but being a prostitute or a high-class escort, I do face, and as with other women or anyone who's involved in the sex industry, we have a lot of social stigma against us. So therefore, if people know about our profession, it affects our social mobility, it affects our relationships. So for protecting myself, in order for me to potentially get ahead in life in other aspects, I need to protect my identity. I'm very worried about social rejection because I have faced that before.
Who exactly are you afraid of?
To be quite honest, it's mostly, let's say for instance, I wanted to get a job in a certain field. And if my identity is revealed, I could be rejected. If I got into a relationship with somebody potentially and they found out my profession, the stigma and the stereotypes that are associated with the stigma works against me. And people cannot understand it because most women who do my work don't actually have a voice. We usually have other people speaking for us. So a lot of what people know about women who sell themselves is through these stereotypes.
And despite your anonymity, your blog gives us a very candid insight into your life. Why did you choose to start writing about it?
I've always written, but I started writing about my blog because I saw so many mass media depictions about escorts, prostitutes, however you want to label it. And it really bothered me because what I saw is either a kind of a dichotomy of one extreme of seeing escorts as completely victims and exploited. And then on the other hand, what you find in the, especially in North American media, you find glamorization of the sex industry. And I think that's very problematic too, because we're not, again, hearing the voices of prostitutes themselves. We're hearing, again, somebody speak on their behalf. So the aim of my blog actually was to give a voice, and it's my own voice, and my experience is quite unique. But what I have found through various comments is that a lot of women who do this work also relate to how I feel.
Iman, what would you say in response to that? Got anything to contribute?
I mean, Sahar, all I can say is like, you're quite courageous to have a blog and to write actually specific things about your daily life on this. You're quite courageous to choose such an industry to work with as well, to work in as well.
Yeah. I think what is essential too, and what I speak out about on my blog, is that we really need to complicate this idea of choice. Because I think a lot of women, even if they're not trafficked, the assumption is that they make a choice to enter the industry, which is actually, it's not quite that simple. So.
Yeah. And I suppose you have chosen this industry out of your own will, if I'm correct.
I wouldn't say choice, because when I entered this industry, I was very young. I was in need of money, but I didn't know the implications of the choice I was making. So I have to say, I wouldn't say it's choice so much. It was my circumstances. There's a lot of women who wouldn't have been in my circumstances and wouldn't have made that choice. And again, how much, when you're a young lady or anyone, how much can it really be called a choice when you're not influenced of the implications of that choice, when you're not aware?
And I think for me, one of the things, I mean, I'd like to say, Sahar, thank you very much for taking part in this, because when you were talking, a lot of the things that you were saying really echoed my experience, although we're very different people, I imagine. The whole issues around stigmatization and the fact that because of stigma and because of criminalization, that kind of doesn't force the silence upon us, but as you were saying, it's a courageous thing to speak out, because it is tremendously risky. And what we need to do is step away. I spend quite a lot of time in conversations around the politics of prostitution in the UK, and often it's tremendously stereotyped, it's tremendously cliched, and it's kind of like either people are kind of shivering crack whores, or they're trafficked virgins, or they're happy hookers. And the last thing that women in the sex industry need is more stereotypes. Absolutely. We need to look at people's experiences and respect that complexity and diversity, and actually listen to women in the sex industry about creating solutions to the problems that we face.
And Sahar, are many of the Middle Eastern men who come to you, are they married?
Actually quite, I think it would really depend on the demographics of your city, firstly. I mean, I live in a city right now where there's an influx of a lot of Middle Eastern students, particularly from the Gulf Arab states. So they are single, but I have seen married men. But for me as an escort, I mean, whether somebody's status, whether single, married, it's quite irrelevant unless we get quite personal.
And you talk about the fact that they respect you in general.
Yes. I also note on my blog that my experience is quite different, because I thankfully have the luxury of kind of choosing my work, who I see. And the most unfortunate part is that most women don't have that option. And I didn't always have that option. I kind of started off as, working for a high-end agency where clients were given to me. But for the most part, I do see men who are quite respectful, because over the years I've learned how to screen. I've learned how to decipher who is potentially, going to treat me with
What I find
respect.
very interesting about your blog is that you talk about self-love and working on inner beauty. Yet you describe the industry as soulless, and you say you're addicted to money. Can you elaborate on that sort of dilemma there?
Yeah. Well, throughout the years, what I've realized, I don't think the sex industry has to be bad, but unfortunately, it has been made bad for a variety of reasons. Sex could be something. I think in the sex industry, unfortunately, it's very physical. It's shallow. It's not based on intimacy, chemistry. And a lot of women who sell themselves are doing it in a very objectified manner where they're basically just giving their body. And men also assume that since most women do that, that they can just use a woman's body without reaching into her, you know, into who she is as a person. And over the years, I've decided that if I'm going to continue to do this in a positive aspect, that I have to also try to connect with men on a level where they actually like me as a person. And that's been very uplifting. But of course, I still have to remember that the majority of clients that we're catering to don't have this mentality, that they still see us as an object that we need to, you know, it's just physical sex. And I try to separate that. I believe true intimacy is actually, you know, it's a combination. It's mind, body, soul. So I think for me, I struggled a lot in the early years is that I objectified myself and I neglected my inner self. And over the years, I had to realize that, you know, if I'm going to conduct this in a positive way, I have to be myself from within and also find men. There are clients who actually do respect
And was
women
that
as a
by
full
choice or
human
by
being.
force? Was that
Sorry?
by choice or by force?
Sorry, in what aspect?
Your decision to do that? So,
I would say circumstance. It just came, and it's kind of an evolution. I'd say most women who do this work, the way your thought process, it changes, you know, as you get more and more experienced.
now you're an educated lady, you write well, you can empower women, and your blog has a high readership. Could it be that you're encouraging young girls to become escorts? How would you feel if girls told you they're inspired to become an escort, to enter the profession after reading your blog?
Yeah, well, I've had mixed cases. I've had a lot of women approach me who say they appreciate my blog, and I'm very blunt that I'm saying that there are a lot of negative implications, unfortunately, that come along with high-class escorting. So I wouldn't actually say that my blog would encourage women, because I've had a lot of women contact me and say, you know, I was considering escorting, but after reading your blog, I realized it's not the field I want to go to. So when women contact me and say they want to get into it, the first thing I usually do is I say, please think of another alternative, because I think you have to be extremely resilient.
When you don't
negative,
escort, Sahar, what do you do?
Sorry?
Do you go to university?
I do go to university full-time, so yes. And I do try to do a lot of research towards the sex industry and towards legalities and social norms that, you know, influence human sexuality and gender.
And so that's what you do when you're not escorting?
Yes.
You have a job as well, though, do you not?
Sorry.
You have a job as well?
I don't, no. So basically, I would consider myself, I'm a full-time university student. I work part-time. I mostly see regular clientele. Yeah.
And do you travel with your clientele?
I do get offers of travel. I prefer actually not to, unless I'm very, very well acquainted with them. I would consider getting more personal, and for me, traveling with the client is quite personal. But for my own personal experience, I've always been a bit, I have to work in my comfort, and that would be out of my comfort zone. However, there are many escorts who are comfortable with meeting clients in public, and they do travel with them. But because of my cultural background, and I would say that I'm very skeptical about being seen in public with clients.
Okay, thank you so much, Sahar.
Thank you very much.
Iman, did anything come up for you there?
Yeah, I mean, the word intimacy, emotional, you mentioned that Sahar is addicted to money, and I wondered whether, I would have loved to ask her whether she had thought at one point for any way out, if it was her addiction to money that wanted her to stay there, and whether money was equivalent to her for the intimacy and emotional part that she wanted to feel in life.
I think that's one of the problems for a lot of people working in prostitution, is that for me this is the highest hourly rate I will ever earn. And for a lot of people who are coming from a situation where they are not necessarily particularly well educated or not necessarily kind of have a particular range of economic options available to them. So to give an example of a friend of mine who's transitioning out of the industry at the moment, she has simply had to accept that she will be earning 10% on an hourly basis of what she has earned in prostitution. And obviously for most people to say, okay, well, I'm going to get another job and it's going to be a 90% pay cut. Whatever line of work you're in, whether you're working for an NGO or for a TV company or working in prostitution or working in a restaurant, that's a very difficult decision to make.
The financial situation.
It's about finances. And again, it's about comparisons. It's about the fact that generally for women, there is very little. There is, I would say in London, there is pretty much no well-paid, flexible, part-time work available to women that is not...
But what does that do to your soul? Yeah. How does that feel?
Well, I think certainly I've worked in the industry for 15 years. My experience has been really positive, personally. And I've met people who've had a really wide range of experiences.
But do you have a relationship?
I have. I've had relationships. I've had relationships with somebody I met through work. I've had clients that I've been seeing for 9 or 10 years. But I think a lot of it depends on the kind of attitude that you come into the work with. So if you do any job where the only reason that you're doing this is for money and you hate the job and you hate everything about it, then you will probably have a rotten time. Again, whether you're working for an NGO, whether you're working for a TV company, whether you're working in prostitution. Also, the difference about prostitution for many people is that this is something that they cannot talk about. So if you have a bad day at work, or if you have a great day at work and something hilarious happens and, you know, this guy fell off the bed or sort of, and suddenly he came out wearing a zebra costume, you can't go and sit in the pub with your friends or sit in a coffee shop with your friends and talk about that.
Weren't you able to find another profession?
The situation I was in at the time, this was the best option available to me, but that's by definition, whatever situation people are in, they will choose the best option.
And it was the best option for economic reasons?
It was the best option for economic reasons, and as it was, I went into it and the work suited me. However, had it not suited me, the economic pressures I was under were still there, and the comparative options to me were still very limited.
Okay,
I mean, Kat, I suppose it is a vicious circle. I mean, once you start, whether it's, I suppose every single, I don't want to actually generalize, but most probably almost every single person who ended up in prostitution, it was due to socioeconomic reasons that they ended up in this field. And at one point you've reached a level where you're earning that enough money, where you're able to sustain your life. And you have a decision to make, either stay in this vicious circle where you don't have that life where you can share your feelings, your emotions, your day-to-day basic things that you want to share with anyone, as you just mentioned.
But I think you can do. I mean, I think if you, I mean, again, I was relatively unusual in that I was able to be fairly open to my social circle, which meant that there were people I could discuss and see how I felt with this.
Again, that's in the UK, but
yes.
we're talking about
absolutely.
when I'm taking this context into the Middle East, where the law is always, even if you have a law and it's legalized, you're always stigmatized.
Yeah,
and there's always
yes, absolutely, of honor.
Absolutely, and there's always this. As Sahar said, she is in the US, but nevertheless she does not want to be seen with any client, no matter who he is. She does not want to travel with anyone, although she's been in this field for a while, but she doesn't want to do this because that's going to ruin her life. So again, I'm giving up on a whole load of my life for me to be, I'm living as if two kind of lives, one which is the hidden, where I'm getting my money and my financial satisfaction, I can say, and one where I'm being a student and I'm going out down the street and this, and there's nothing wrong with me. But at the same time, these two things are going to intersect at one point, most probably to Sahar or to anyone else, because that clientele might end up having a friend that she's going to get married to, you know what I mean? So it is quite a high risk. So it's a vicious circle that at one point, can't you feel that you can get out of it? That's my question to you.
But that's about social attitudes. Those problems are not about prostitution. They're not about the having sex for money part of the situation. They're about the social attitudes to women in the sex industry and to women's sexual behaviour generally.
Joining us now on Skype is Dr. Belinda Brooks-Gordon, reader in psychology and social policy at Birkbeck University. Belinda, what are the characteristics of men who use prostitutes, especially Middle Eastern men?
Well, one of the things that we know about clients is that they're more likely to be working away from home, and they're more likely to come from cultural groups where sex before marriage is prohibited. So that also would indicate that you're more likely to see greater numbers of clients in Middle Eastern men.
And do you think religious views have an effect on whether women are objectified and seen as consumable?
It can certainly have an effect on how much power women have within society, and that can then impact any added stigma and how much chance they have to negotiate, certainly, with clients.
And is there a difference, in your opinion, between a prostitute and an escort?
Well, they're all working in the sex industry. So everybody is working in the sex industry. It's like saying, is there a difference between, you know, a high roller at a bank and somebody who's saving up and investing a small amount?
And what are the psychological
effects? The transaction is not dissimilar.
Sorry, what are the psychological effects on prostitutes?
Well, the evidence is very, very equivocal on that. We've got no evidence, quite frankly, as a psychologist, and I've investigated this area very thoroughly. There is no evidence to say one way or another what the impact may or may not be. And the reason for that is that the studies are so poorly controlled. They've not managed to eliminate other variables. And they don't have good baseline measures. So as a scientist, you can't say what the impact are. There's some very poor studies funded by vested interest who have said, oh, they all have post-traumatic stress disorder. But when you actually look at those studies properly, you realise that the people giving the tests, they're not proper psychometric tests. They're just ones that they invented themselves on a scale of 1 to 10. Oh, you look a bit sad. I'll put you at number 9. They're not qualified to interpret the tests. And the British Psychological Society has condemned that aspect of work. So you can't, we honestly at this stage in time can't say.
And why are more and more intelligent, educated women seeing prostitution as an option? I mean, is it a consequence of the materialistic society we live in?
No, it's always existed, and there will always be, throughout history, you've had some people who are either more materialistic or others, or have felt their needs were greater. So you look at, you know, Thackeray's work and Becky Sharp, and people who have wanted to rise through society and have very high aspirations. And for some people, sex work is a way of achieving that. For others, it is a way of earning much more when they decide to go into sex work, earning much more than they could in other occupations. So, for example, one particularly good study, Tila Saunders' study of 50 sex workers working in off-street locations, found that nearly half, 48% of those, had either a nursing, a caring or a teaching qualification. And they had chosen because they could work for a small number of hours. It offers relatively high pay for a small number of hours within a very flexible working environment. So it fitted in with childcare and other things. And that's not uncommon. We see that cross-culturally across studies.
And Belinda, do women really ever escape the industry?
Oh gosh, a huge amount go in and out of the sex industry. And don't forget, the sex industry itself is very, very broad. People always think that sex work is just penetrative, heterosexual sex, when in fact it's so disparate. It spreads from webcam operators to people doing rinsing and financial domination work, across the board to people doing dominatrice work and who never perform penetrative sex. In fact, you know, the vast number of people, it's actually non-penetrative sex that is given in parlours and off-street locations when we look at the studies. So it spans a vast variety of people, and it also, a lot of people dip in and dip out of sex work. Years ago, some people used to be called quarterlies because the bills used to come in every quarter, and that was when they would just go and turn a few tricks, if you like, in order to pay the bills. And so it's often used as well alongside another occupation as a supplementary occupation for some people for a short period of time to achieve a specific goal, either pay off a debt or to down payment on a house or something, set up a business, something like that, and then they exit sex work.
Thank you, Belinda Brooks, for joining us.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
One of the parallels that I was thinking with the last question to Belinda was around, for migrants to the UK, is the parallel with minicab driving for men, in that this is an occupation most people have at least the rudimentary skill appropriate to each occupation. It's something that's very flexible, it's something that's a relatively unregulated occupation. And so certainly in London, as somebody who's a long-time London resident, I've had conversations with many cab drivers who've clearly been wildly overqualified for driving a cab, but because of their migrant status and because of, frankly, a fairly racist immigration policy from the British government, this is the best option for them. So again, it's about the range of economic options available. And in terms of the idea of whether women can ever escape the sex industry, to go back to what Sahar was saying, the difference between prostitution and most other kinds of temporary, part-time, flexible work is that the stigma of this is very resilient. So if somebody says to you, oh, what did you do when you were at university? Oh, I worked part-time in a restaurant, or I worked part-time, I sort of worked behind a bar. You'd be like, oh yeah, well I did, I worked in a shoe shop. If somebody says to you, I worked as a prostitute, suddenly there's going to be a lot of drama. They could lose jobs. Certainly, again, there are many reports of people being fired or being refused work because their history in the sex industry became apparent.
But that's why there's a need always to work with different government authorities, to work on different platforms, to educate people, to bring awareness, and to be able to break the silence of whether it's the migrant workers, whether it's the prostitutes that don't have a voice that they need to hear, or whether it's the forced trafficked women.
We will move to the next section. There is prostitution by choice, but for some unfortunate women, and even men, they are forced into this life. Syrian refugee girls are being exploited for prostitution, and minors are being sold in all countries that host Syrian refugees. In Lebanon, last year, 27 cases were recorded involving Syrian prostitutes and their managers. Farah is a young Syrian refugee woman in Lebanon who has turned to prostitution to survive. With her father too sick to work and her brother chronically injured by a bomb in Damascus, she is the last person in her family able to make ends meet. According to Lebanese authorities, 73% of prostitutes in Lebanon are Syrian. Prostitutes either work on the streets or, like Farah, they work in so-called super nightclubs, which are brothels masquerading as nightclubs. Let's take a look at this report.
My name is Farah. I am from Syria. I tried to work in a normal shop, but I found this is the best way to meet my expenses. I wake up around 11 and take a shower. I only get 2 hours a day to myself when I start moving, and I go where I'm to be working, and the customers start coming. Some you know, some you don't. It's nightlife.
Where are all the hot girls?
If you want the hot girls, go downstairs.
They go up to the dance floor and the customers can see them and pick out which one they want to take out for the night. Syrians are out on the streets, in places that are illegal, Hazmiya, everywhere, in Lebanon. They are affecting the businesses. They don't have a place to rent or anything. We're not giving them what they deserve. If they didn't need the money, they would come here.
It's very hard. I don't even like this. It will affect me a lot because in this society, whether Lebanese or Syrian, it affects the girl. If someone met me and he knows what they would say about me, they wouldn't take me.
Mostly super nightclubs are for foreigners, but we do have some Syrians there. But for Syrian women, it's either the man comes to their homes or they are referred to someone by the man. In terms of human trafficking, 73% of the total arrests are Syrians.
In the last year, many things have changed in my life, especially when my brother lost his hand and no hospital would accept him. My father got sick. That's why I do these things, especially when my brother had to have surgery and a ligament transplant. I have to take responsibility because I'm the oldest. My brothers are too young and I cannot make them go to work. They still go to school, that's why. I blame no one, but I wish I was born a boy. So there would be someone older than me to take responsibility.
Joining us now is Lisa Davis, Human Rights Advocacy Director at Madre and Clinical Professor of Law at CUNY Law School. You've worked with women in the Middle East, Lisa. Could you tell us about the work you do and the types of girls you're dealing with?
Well, we partner with local grassroots women's organizations in Iraq and Syria and other countries who do a lot of direct service and outreach to marginalized victims, including women and girls that are engaged in sexual exploitation or have been victims of trafficking.
And from a legalities point of view, what are the challenges involved in reaching out to these vulnerable women?
Well, I think a large problem is that there's just not enough access to resources, direct services that are provided, or strong laws to address the issues that women faced. So what we see is a lot of women that are entering into the sex industry or being forced into it because of reasons that stem back to economic deprivation. And then once they're engaged in this work, all sorts of other rights of theirs are violated, and they're often left vulnerable to being killed and other fates.
And time again, you hear of women being punished and men being exempt from punishment. In reality, can women break free from the cycle of abuse?
I think that women can absolutely break free, and that's why organizations such as the Organization for Women's Freedom in Iraq, or in Syria, the Syrian Women's League, these organizations that are working on the ground to address these issues and to reach out to women and to help them start new lives. These are the organizations that we should be supporting as an international community, since they have direct contact and they can make a change.
Can you talk a bit about the temporary marriages that happen, that enable trafficking to happen?
Well, temporary marriages are certainly a critical issue in the Middle East and are on a severe rise in Iraq and Syria, considering the current conflict situation. Oftentimes they happen because of, again, financial desperation, where families are economically challenged or destitute and are looking for ways to be able to create some sort of income, or they can't take care of their young women in their family, and they are subjected to what are temporary marriages, which are really, it's the equivalent to prostitution.
Iman, do you have anything to say?
Yeah, I would add most probably, Lisa, it's good to have you with us, first of all. And secondly, I think I'd add as well, Jordan, I think there's a large percentage of young girls, Syrian girls, currently in the refugee camps, that their families decide that the option is to actually give them away for this temporary marriage in order to prevent any kind of sexual abuse for them to take place in the camp. But unfortunately, that actually takes them into the trafficking and into the forced prostitution without their consent in any way, shape or form.
And one of the things I was thinking during the report and while we were listening to Lisa is that I think you need to look at issues around prostitution within a context, and particularly in this situation, I was thinking of the context around protection for women generally against violence, whether it's domestic violence within the family, within kind of by a husband, and also in terms of the attitudes to the police. So, for example, there's a lot of data around violence against women in the sex industry from the police.
War is definitely different.
Yes.
Than prostitution by choice.
I think those two, both those kind of ideas are both quite simplistic. In any situation, individuals have a degree of choice, and they may have greater or lesser range of options. So I think one of the things that my organisation talks about is protection for women in the sex industry, whether they're by choice, circumstance or coercion, because any human being is facing a limited range of options. I can't suddenly decide to be, oh, today I'd like to be an astronaut, or today say I'd like to be 5'9", everybody's options are limited, and regardless of whether they are there by choice, circumstance or coercion, they deserve the full protection of the law.
Yeah, but Lisa, sorry, over to you. Do you agree with this? Does every girl have a choice?
Of course, women absolutely deserve the full protection of the law, and anyone who is engaged, whether it's sex work, sexual exploitation, or sex trafficking or sexual slavery. And what we find is that these populations are at the most risk for human rights violations. I mean, we've seen in Iraq where there have been massacres of women that have been alleged to be in prostitution by militias or by ISIL or by others. And there is just no redress at all. So oftentimes they're at the most risk for human rights violations happening. And that needs to be a priority and taken seriously.
And Lisa, how are girls affected by prostitution after they perhaps leave the trade?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
After they leave the trade, if they can?
Did you say how are they affected?
Exactly.
Well, you know, social stigma, whether it's rape or trafficking or you know, other forms of commercial sex work, is highly stigmatized in the area. And what we have seen, Madre has been documenting, is a rise in suicides, a rise in honor killings, and a rise in women being re-trafficked because of not having other viable economic opportunities.
And what do you want to see being done?
Well, yeah, in terms of the conflict in Syria and Iraq, I would hope that the international community would prioritize protecting women's rights, both in terms of the context of where militias are operating, but also in terms of where governments have control over areas. That we need to expand the view of the conflict to include women in all areas and look at all human rights that are affected in these areas, and look at long-term solutions in terms of strengthening laws, ending bad policies such as the pending Joffrey law in Iraq that, if passed, would reduce the legal age of marriage to age 9, and looking at building up economic opportunities so that women that are affected by the conflict and women in general have more opportunities to be able to live their lives.
And Iman, what can be done on the ground in your opinion?
I mean, I do second on what Lisa has just mentioned. But in addition to that, I think I do call on the international community and on the different civil society organizations that are in the Middle East to work together in making sure that we can, at one point, it's going to take ages to be able to integrate these women back and these girls back into society. Obviously, there is a social stigma, but if we don't have a place and a shelter, a safe place for them to even be able to get to, where they can start their lives, even if it's in a secret place, safe place, they can start there, start their lives in order not to commit suicide, in order to be able to step by step bring them back into the society, which is going to take ages. But if we don't have even these safe places, I think we're facing a dead end.
Because their reputation can be damaged.
Absolutely.
For forever. And
Absolutely.
their children and their families.
Absolutely. I mean, the stories that we've heard about women in Iraq and women currently in Jordan that have been trafficked, even when they choose to leave that industry, they're always threatened by their pictures being sent to their families, to their sisters that are married, and to ruining further their families and their reputation. So we need to have a kind of a strategy on how we can protect these women that choose to have this choice to leave this industry and move on into this safe place before we can integrate them back into the society.
And can you tell us a bit about Karamatura?
So Karamatura is a research that we've put together around women that have been trafficked out of Iraq following the Iraq war into Syria and the surrounding countries, where currently we have a fear that most of these women, the Iraqi women that have fled into Syria, are now being trafficked out from Syria into other countries. That piece of research that we've done has highlighted that there's a large number of women, around 50,000 women, that have been trafficked out of Iraq, and we're talking into forced prostitution into the different Middle Eastern countries. The youngest was 11 years old, that was sold for $30,000 into Saudi Arabia. It's been reported that some of these young girls and women have had to have sex between 10 to 15 times on a daily basis with 10 to 15 men, on a daily basis. We're running currently a report that will highlight what's happening to the Syrian women that have been trafficked out of Iraq into the different Middle Eastern countries, and our main research is being done in Jordan.
Just to clarify to our viewers, Karamatura means our dignity. And we'll just go back to Lisa, just to say a thank you for joining us, Lisa.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
I just want to talk about double standards and how in like Dubai to kiss publicly is illegal, or you could be sent to prison. Yet prostitution is rife, and it's almost regarded as tourism. What would you have to say to that, Iman?
Well, money is power, and not being able to kiss in public or hold hands even in public in Dubai is criminalized and is illegal. While having prostitutes and legalized prostitution in Dubai, where you get your folder when you come into the country, this is what you can do, these are the guidelines of your job role. Role description is like this, these are the hotels that you can do, these are the timings they can use, is allowed. So this is income to the country, while that one is like morals and double standards, as you just mentioned, Anna. So from that perspective, I don't only want to highlight even Dubai in this as a country, like as a Middle Eastern countries. You can see it in so many other places as well, where people would regard prostitution as something which is really bad, and it's like I can take the UK as an example. Some people would look at the prostitution as something which is really bad, that's offensive, that's stereotyped, and at the same time, we're talking about an open democratic country where everyone is open for choice to do whatever you want. So we're talking about two different powers, two different governments.
I think double standards are rife in almost every society. They may vary, and there may be kind of nuance between, but generally societies, there is no society on earth that has an open, honest, meaningful conversation about sexual behaviour. And that's one of the things that I think is really problematic about how we treat prostitution. All the kind of worst fantasies we have as a society seem to be played out around the politics of prostitution, not just in the reality where experience is very diverse, but we will only solve the problems associated with prostitution when we start looking at the reality and also start looking at root problems. Where prostitution is at its worst, it is generally a symptom that the people involved have already had an extraordinarily problematic set of experiences. So trying to deal just with prostitution, it's a symptom, it's not a cause of those fundamental problems.
Iman, I want to know a little bit about Scheme and how you help women through education.
So what we try to do is education. I mean, you picked up on the word education and awareness raising. What we try to do as much as we can is spread the word around what's happening really currently in the Middle East, whether it's for women, whether it's for young people, whether it's for girls. We do awareness campaigns around the issues of trafficking, around the issues of prostitution. We do tend to tell women and educate girls that you have a right of choice. You have a right to choose what you want. It's your body, it's your life. You have the choice over it. And for them to be aware that it's not about having this fancy knight that is coming on his horse because he's got this money to take me over and get married to me and I'm done. I'm gonna get out of this camp, get out of this refugee camp, get out of a family where I'm being exploited, and I'm gonna leave to this fancy life. It's not the case. Read, listen, talk to us, learn more about this issue, and seek advice. Seeking advice is important. Having a listening ear is important. And that's what we try to offer, that's what we try to do. And what we would like also to do is call on the international communities and the different governments that we're working with, in the Middle East, is to actually work together to formulate an appropriate response and programs for these girls and women who were forced into prostitution, who were forced into trafficking, and find a solution for them. Because at one point we need to break the silence that they're living in.
So we're empowering women
through education,
to learn other skills as well through education.
Absolutely.
Arts,
vocational skills, whether they can become themselves the women that can actually empower the young girls currently of their experiences and share their stories. Sharing your stories sometimes and storytelling empowers you as a person. At the same time, you share your emotional experience. But at the same time, the other person, you're helping that other person to hear that story and to hear really what happens on the ground. And that's a very powerful tool that needs to be used.
Well, that's very powerful and a commendable organisation.
Thank you.
As we come to the end of our show, we can see that the main reason for women going into the sex trade is due to the pull of financial gain, whether it be out of choice or force. Every individual, of course, should have a choice of what life they want to lead. However, for those who are unfortunate enough to have to sell their bodies out of desperation, international awareness should be raised to help them find other means of survival. I'd like to thank all my guests on the show today: Lisa Davis, Dr. Belinda Brooks-Gordon, Sahar, and of course my studio guests, Kat Stevens and Iman Abou-Atta. Join us again for our next episode of Forbidden Talk. Goodbye.